Wild and Woolly Ozarks, episode number 13. For real this time. Gather up the kids and the old folks. Shut down the contraptions and dim the lights. Put away your pocket-sized magic lantern shows. Close your eyes and listen. It's time to strike off on the paths less traveled. Trail through the hills and hollers, along the river banks and into the brush. Hear tales of things often forgotten, or maybe best left kept that way, get told. Join me as we venture into the wild and woolly Ozarks. I'm your native guide and host, Champ Heron. Welcome back, folks. It's good to be with you again. We had a little bit of a podcast hiatus. We had our post-Halloween sugar rush. And things during our sugar high, we saw visions of episodes in November and kind of came back to earth, had a half a dozen ribeyes and about 3 quarts of buttermilk and a few pipefuls of that good red Virginia tobacco. And the shakes had mostly stopped. Back to normal. Undefined gradient for your host, normal, but I'm back. A big thank you to all who liked and shared our Halloween hodgepodge episodes. That was great. We had a lot of fun recording those. A big thank you to our guests who chipped in on the Halloween season, especially TJ Wilkinson, Tammy Morton, Angel Wolf, Justin Miner, Amber Vance, and Joshua Heston. You all are great, and we're looking forward to having you back. Another big thank you to all who showed up for our walk on Halloween night around the Marshfield Square. We saw some old friends and wonderfully well made some new ones. You all were a fun crowd. We enjoyed it. We can't wait to do it again. A lot of people have asked if we're going to be doing another one, and I'm thinking maybe what date works? I've thought about the Friday after Thanksgiving, that night. I don't know, maybe a bunch of you'd be liquored up by then, be quite entertaining, who knows? But I don't know, we could do it one night. I've also thought about doing an afternoon cemetery walk, but maybe do that sometime this winter. Let us know what you think in the comments below, right after you hit that subscribe and like button. Share this with your friends, in-laws, outlaws, Catholic, Protestant, and Jew. It's made for all who have an interest in the place where history meets lore. It really helps us to know we are hitting the mark for action-packed Ozark content. So tonight, straight from the Ozarks mouth, we have an Ozarks weather prediction by none other than the Bull Goose himself, Vance Randolph.
Hello, this is Vance Randolph. I know deer hunters in Arkansas who think that if autumn campfire spits and sputters more than usual, it means that a snowstorm is not far off. The firewood, they say, is stomping snow. Mr. Albert Short of Crane, Missouri, agrees with the deer hunters. If your wood fries and sings and pops and cracks, he says, it's a sure sign snow's a-comin'. Children in the backwoods sometime make a great show of counting nodules on cane, the knots on a lilac bush, the spots on a bass in September, the freckles on their left hand, and so on, to determine the number of cold spells to be experienced in the coming winter. I do not believe that any of these signs are taken very seriously by adult hill folk.
That was Vance Randolph, Bull Goose of the Ozarks, with this week's weather lore. Should you feel inclined to track down one of these legends and tell us how they end up, we invite you to do so. We all invite you to give us a note, drop us a note at wildandwoollyozarks@gmail.com, particularly if you have anything you think we need to know about. And now for the story. On April 13th, 1928, a cold, chilly Friday the 13th, one of the biggest disasters to happen in the Ozarks rocked the town of West Plains. 60 people had gathered in a public rental hall, locally referred to as Bond Hall, to dance to the music of the time. The Friday night dances were a regular event in West Plains. They were sponsored by Bob and Sula Martin, the owners of the biggest Ford dealership in West Plains. The dances attracted the sons and daughters from the most prominent families in West Plains and the surrounding communities. The April 13th event was the first since the Lent and Easter recess, and the young people of the town were anxious to put on their dancing shoes. At 11:05 p.m., just before intermission, the band was playing the prophetic jazz song At Sundown when a massive explosion ripped through the hall. The dancers were blasted up, up, up into the rainy nighttime sky. They crashed back down along with the bricks, girders, and assorted debris, and into the firestorm that consumed the explosion site within minutes. Their lives ended or changed forever, and their families and community were never completely recovered from the events of that horrific night. I'm talking tonight with Lin Waterhouse, who has authored the book, The West Plains Dance Hall Explosion. And Lin, welcome to the wild and woolly Ozarks. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Champ. I'm honored to be here to talk about the book and to talk about the explosion that happened that night and that was so devastating to the community.
Well, why don't you tell us about how you came upon this, maybe a little background about yourself, and take us through. Every writer has sort of an origin story and a story of how they got on the topic. So why don't you fill us in?
Okay, well, I was pretty much a newcomer to the Ozarks. Of course, you know that anybody who hasn't been born and bred here is a newcomer, but my husband had been born here, and we retired here back in 2000 at the millennium. And I began writing for the local newspaper and some of the regional magazines that were publishing at that time. And Fred Pfister, maybe you know, was the editor of the Ozark Mountaineer for years and years and years. And I wrote for the Mountaineer for Fred for many years. And one day he called me and he said, I need an anniversary piece on the West Plains Dance Hall explosion. And I said, the what? And he said, the West Plains Dance Hall explosion. You don't know what that is? And I said, no. And he said, you live there and you don't know what happened in West Plains in 1928? And I said, no. And he said, well, you go on over to the library and you do some research and you give me 1,000 words by Monday. And I said, okay. So I marched on over to the library, and the West Plains Library has an excellent genealogy room that is just stock full of information about the history of the area. And I wrote that piece for Fred, and it appeared in the Ozark Mountaineer. And normally I would have just gone on and, kind of forgotten about it and gone on to write other things. But that story just stayed with me. I could not get over what had happened that night. And every time I would drive down the square over in West Plains, I was reminded of what happened there that night. And I just kept accumulating more and more information on the explosion. And eventually I had enough information that I thought I could put together into a book. And so I did that, but I could not sell it to a publisher because they all thought it was much too local a story, even though that had been a story that had been covered nationally and even internationally at the time. But I find one day my friend Fred called me up and he said, I've got an editor here from the History Press from London. And he said the History Press is moving into the United States and they want to specialize in local history. And I said, okay. And he said, I've told him about your book and he wants it by Monday. And that was on Friday. So, so the only thing was that they only wanted 50,000 words and I had 80,000 words. So I spent the whole weekend literally rewriting the book because I didn't want to leave anything out. I thought that all of the pertinent information should still be included in that book, no matter what the word limitation was. So that was how I came to sell it and it came out and it's been a pretty good seller ever since. It's such a great story that everybody who reads it is just fascinated by it.
You know, sometimes things dawn on me at the darndest time. You're the Lin Waterhouse that used to write for the Ozark Mountaineer.
Oh yeah.
Knew, I knew your name, and I was I was like, well, it must be just the dance hall book or whatever. I had seen it, but I could not place why I knew your name, and I remember that. I remember that when that was I was taking the Mountaineer at the time and wrote a
Yeah.
article or two myself. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I'll be
I'm
darned.
so sorry that it's gone. And we've lost so many of our regional magazines now. It's a shame.
Yeah, and you know, that's reconstituting the Ozarks Mountaineer. That's a long discussion.
Yeah.
It has been had in one form or another. What would it be like today? It'd have to be about digital. But there's a really good, you look at it. Josh Heston does State of the Ozarks. Caitlin McConnell does Ozarks Alive. There is some good local regional journalism, but
Yes.
back to where we were. So you covered the story for the Mountaineer and you did a lot of research, evidently, and then you got your book published. Well,
Huh?
kudos on that. But if you don't mind, take us through the background of the dance hall and the dance and take us up to that night if you would, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, West Plains was really the gem of the area back in 1928. I mean, it was just really a bustling, prosperous community. And it really was extraordinary for the area and for the time. Um, and that night, young people had come from all over West Plains and the local area to attend the dance, which was a regular Friday night dance, as you said in the intro, that was sponsored by the Martins. Bob and Sula Martin, who owned the local Ford dealership, and the people that attended the dance were really the kind of the cream of youth in West Plains at the time, if you want to use kind of a strange expression, but they were not seedy people. They were not low class people. They were just lovely, ordinary people, most of them with college degrees, many of them business people in the community, and they were the sons and daughters of the most prosperous people in West Plains. And they were the people that regularly attended. They were young. I think the youngest that night was 17 and the oldest would have been the Martins, who were in their 30s and late 30s. And so they were generally a young group. And this was the first dance after Lent and Easter that year. And so there were, I think, probably young people really were intent on attending the dance that night because they hadn't had one for a while. And so their estimated 60 people were there that night. And the only hiccup that evening was that there was an influenza um, kind of an epidemic going around at the time. And the band that they had actually contracted to play for that night uh, had checked out on them because several of them were ill. And so they recruited local people to make up the three-piece band. The piano player was the daughter of Bob and Sula Martin, and she was also a beauty queen and an aspiring actress and a college student. And then Dale Allen, who was a high school student, but he played music all around the community. And then Carl Mullins, who played the trap drums. And so that was their band for that night. And plus, there was a saxophone there, and Dale could play it, and other people came up and would play it. As I said, they were quite a talented group, and a lot of musicians in that group.
Well, help the listeners out if you would. Take us in West Plains to where this building's set, and then describe the building, if you would, and maybe some of the occupants of it, and that history, if you would.
Yeah, it's just this explosion occurred just off the West Plains Square on East Main Street, on the first block of East Main Street off the square. And there were three buildings on that block. And the Bond Hall was in the building that was in the center building. And when the explosion occurred, the explosion took out all three buildings on that block. So it left nothing but just debris behind after that explosion. They were old buildings. There's pictures. I have a picture in the book, I think that occurred in 1911, which was a picture of that building. And so you can tell that it was quite an old building even at that time. And there was testimony at the coroner's investigation that the floor of the building, which was a cement floor on the bottom level, the Main Street level, was cracked and broken. And so it was a building that was maybe in a certain state of disrepair. However, it was a popular spot. Bond Hall hosted birthday events and showers, baby showers, and all sorts of other events in addition to the dance on Friday nights.
What other tenants were in those buildings? What other businesses?
The lower floors were all occupied by businesses. There was a sweet shop. There was a dairy shop with milk and milk products, dairy products. There was also a plumbing shop. The Western Union office was in that same building on the lower floor, but directly under Bond Hall, there was a auto repair shop owned by Joseph Weiser. And that became very important to the story later on, as Mr. Weiser was generally blamed for the catastrophe. And then upstairs, let me expand that.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Upstairs on the top floor of those buildings, second floor of those buildings were apartments, and there were people living in those apartments. They were by and large kind of considered to be inexpensive, but nice places to live. For people, and there were some single people living there. There was a father and son living there. the owner of the dairy business lived there. He lived in the back of this building that where his business was located. And in another building, there was a woman, her mother, and her four children living. So it was a busy place. It was, very much part of the community.
So these buildings were 3-story.
2 stories. They were
They
two
were two
stories.
stories, and
Two
so
stories. Uh-huh.
so you have all these shops that would be busy during the day. You have on all along the street level. Then you have
Mhm.
Bond Hall in the middle, and then on either side you have apartments,
Yes. And
basically.
Bond Hall was on the second floor.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's
Right.
upstairs, but there was no third story. There were just 2-story buildings, and was there a basement?
There was no basement, no.
Okay.
And the only access to the building to the building, the ward building that Bond Hall was in, was a stairway, a wooden stairway that went up the side of the building. Then inside the garage downstairs, there was also a stairway there that led up to the second floor, but it was a stairway that was not often used because it was within the auto shop.
Okay. Well, hold on.
Oh, I'm not hearing you now.
I accidentally muted. Sorry to
Oh,
all
okay.
involved.
Okay.
I'm trying to get the best sound quality, so I keep muting myself out because no telling what I'll rattle or spill or drop over here. So go ahead and take us through that evening, if you would, Lynn.
Okay. These young people came from all around. There were people that came from Thayer and Mammoth Springs, Alton. There was a train that actually came through there from Thayer to West Plains, and so it was easy for them to ride the train into West Plains. Others came from Mountain Grove. There were several people there from Mountain Grove, and some people from Ava. There was two young men who drove over in um, Alice Holstein was his name. His family called him Chester for some reason. And he was a college student. He was home for the Easter holiday and he had a brand new car. And he enlisted his friend, Charlie Fisher, whose parents owned the Fisher Hotel in Ava, to go with him. And so the two young men drove over from Ava in a Model T. You can imagine the trip that would have been coming over from over the dirt roads from Ava.
I'd have
The
to be in
dance,
traction. I mean,
yeah,
if you think about that, because that's not just a casual drive over there either.
exactly. Yeah, I'm
No.
sure that they must have planned to stay the night someplace in West Plains. I can't imagine they planned to go back again that night.
Yeah,
But
I can't either, but that would certainly be a bone jarring experience. I'm sorry.
yeah, they were young
Yeah.
men, they were up for an adventure. And so there were, as I said, there were 60 people and there that night, and the music was great. Apparently, everybody seemed to be thoroughly enjoying themselves, according to um, people that were there that night. And normally, admission intermission was at 11 o'clock, but they had requested that the band play one more song, and they played what was then a new jazz song at sundown, and turned out to be kind of prophetic because of the lyrics of the song. But at 11:05, there was a horrendous explosion, and they people that were witnesses at a distance said that they saw the dancers blasted 2 stories high into the air, and the explosion was heard all the way to Thayer, more than 20 miles away. So it was a horrendous explosion, and the dancers all fell right back down into all of the, they came back down with the debris, and that was resulted from the explosion, and many of them were trapped under that debris, under metal girders and wooden beams, and a fire immediately broke out as following the explosion, and they were trapped within this this horrendous site. The back wall of the building had had slid backward, outward from the explosion, but it was there at an angle, and the fire, the most of the fire was in the front of the building, and so those people who could fled to the back of the building, but they couldn't get out, and people witnesses said that they saw person after person, excuse me, trying to climb that wall, scale that wall to escape, and then they would slide right back down into the flames. Most of the people that escaped did so by going through the flames and out the front. And several of them said they could see the gas pumps at the Davidson garage, which was directly across the street from the bond building and bond hall, and they moved toward those gas pumps. They used that to sight their way out, and it's just miraculous. There were such stories of heroism of people that had dug survivors out from under debris and carried them out. It's really quite amazing. I can't hear you again.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's
You
okay.
certainly paint in not so many words an absolutely horrifying picture. I mean, the, to imagine you're there and then there you have a complete loss of control over your entire circumstances and the circumstances of everyone around you. It's like a plane that's going down almost. It's sort of
Yes, yes.
the horror that must have went through those people's minds.
Oh God.
God, it's just completely unimaginable. And thankfully, I've not imagined that, and hopefully, I don't get closed out that way. But well, when that explosion occurred, and you say it moved the wall on the back, did it do anything to the apartments on either side? Did they collapse
Yes.
inward?
Everything eventually collapsed. Most of the people did get out. There was an elderly gentleman. He was a Civil War survivor. He was living in an apartment there, and he did not get out. They found him still in his bed. And there was a young man that lived there with his father, and he did not get out, although the father did. He said after the explosion occurred, he looked around and he said he was standing in the middle of debris, and he was looking out the second floor windows because they had come down, and he crawled out one of those second floor windows out onto the level ground.
So the building collapsed in on itself.
Uh-huh.
The apartment building did not, at least didn't fall over on the people who were burning up. Maybe,
Yeah, well, it did. Yeah, it did come down. I mean, when you look at the pictures, it's pretty. Of course, it burned afterwards, so that it's a little bit hard to visualize exactly what must have occurred. It did burn through the third floor of the bank that still sits on the corner of the square and East Main Street. Tony Aide owns that building. And when he renovated that building, he left the burn marks that still exist on the floor of that third floor. He just polyed over them, so they'll be there for as long as the building's there, I guess. And some of the people that survived were literally blown through the front windows. There were three long, narrow windows across the front of the building on the second floor. And several of them were simply blasted right out through that window. The band, in fact, was all was all blasted through that window. And young Sula Martin, who was playing the piano, she probably would have survived, except the piano landed on her.
Oh my
And
God.
yeah, and then Dale Allen, who was the young man, who was playing several instruments, he was blasted through the window, and people saw him lying on the street outside of the building and thought he was dead because he had a pipe protruding from his back. And a friend of his had been outside waiting to come into the dance, and after I turned this down. I don't know why that keeps talking to me. Um, his friend Brunt, got hold of him and dragged him away from the building. And right after that, the facade of the building collapsed onto where he was lying. So his friend literally saved his life.
So the
And
facade of the building collapsed into the street and sidewalk and street in front.
yeah. Yeah, well, one young man wasn't even at the dance. He was just standing outside talking to some friends when the building collapsed on him, and he died. In fact, he would be the great uncle, I guess, of the West Plains mayor, who was the mayor at the time I wrote the book, Mayor Evans, and he spoke about remembering as a young child, hearing the stories about his uncle who was killed in the explosion. Unmute.
Good grief. I tell you what, technology is not my bag. But
mine either.
anyhow, but we shall persevere. So we have this explosion, we have these people, and I know you're going to get into more of the victims, the various victims, and where they were, and that sort of thing. Who's first upon the scene, and what did they find? How quickly did it take West Plains to organize?
Oh, well, there were people there immediately because everybody heard the explosion. People were literally blasted out of their beds. And so and of course, West Plains is a small town. It didn't take them long for the firemen and the police department and the sheriff's office, all of those people to descend on the site. And of course, all of the people that came to help. And I can't imagine, the trauma that those first responders experienced by what they found, because it was a small town. Everybody knew everybody. And here they were dragging their friends and relatives out of this building. And it just must have been a lifetime trauma that they had endured.
Well, I would say so. How many, kind of run us down the casualty list, if you will. And you don't have to go through the names, but like how many people were killed? And then I know there were several that died afterward, but maybe take us through.
Yeah, there was actually there were 39 deaths that night. The 39th actually occurred a week after, but he was the only one that died after that night. Everyone that made it to the hospital that night, to Krista Hogan Hospital, which was at the time state of the art, fortunately, and all of them who made it to the hospital survived. And some of them, one young woman wore a body cast for an entire year. And but she survived. She had 2 spinal fractures, but she did survive, and she went on to live a life. Um, it was stunning though, and how well the hospital operated, how they shifted into catastrophe um, mode in just no time at all. And the volunteers and people just flooded into the hospital to help. And doctors and nurses from other communities came in to lend a hand. And it's really heartening to hear the way the communities came together to take care of the people that were actually injured. Um, I say there were 39 deaths, but I count the 40th as the husband of one of the women who actually died in the explosion. And when he learned of his wife's death, he committed suicide because he could not stand the thought of her burning to death in that horrible, horrible catastrophe.
Yeah, it just sounds awful, the whole thing sounds awful. And to think that, a storm's one thing, but if you have those walls, it's like wadding a shotgun, you know, if the explosion starts below. We're going to get more into what caused the dance hall explosion in a few minutes. We have a word now from our sponsor. And now an important announcement from the Colonel B.H. Quickfoot Publishing Company. Ride with the ball knobbers. The thrill of riding through the hills by the light of the moon is brought to life in our newest publication, an exciting 110-page coloring book that takes you through the life and times of Taney County's infamous regulator band. Ride along with the masked night riders through the hills as you color such scenes as the lynching of the Taylor brothers and the murder of the old blue gobbler himself, Nat Kinney, in the Oak Grove schoolhouse. Uh-oh. Should have just printed it out. Oh, well, Kenneth, we're going to have to. I went into AI mode. Oh my God. Okay, there we go.
Oops.
Then I'm going to do that whole thing again, and we'll have to edit this out. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. I lost you. I lost your picture here. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you just fine.
I've lost you.
I'm here. I still show me. Huh.
Okay, let's try it. Let's bring it back.
Okay. And now an important announcement from the Colonel B.H. Quickfoot Publishing Company. Ride with the ball knobbers. The thrill of riding through the hills by the light of the moon is brought to life in our newest publication, an exciting 110-page coloring book that takes you through the life and times of Taney County's infamous regulator band. Ride along with the masked night riders through the hills as you color such scenes as the lynching of the Taylor brothers and the murder of the old blue gobbler himself, Nat Kinney, in the Oak Grove schoolhouse. Order now and receive free Colonel B.H. Quickfoot's latest work, exploring the travails of the Christian County Ball Knobber Band. Expressed in 18 beautifully illustrated pop-ups, you can follow the ball knobbers through the Christian County countryside, from the murder of the Edens to the trial, endless appeals, and ultimately botched hangings of Dave and Billy Walker and John Matthews. This origamical piece of art, suitable for the coffee table with pop-up gallows and working trap, will be the thrill of children and historians alike. Available by a mail order. Send $18.89 to Quickfoot Publishing, 789 Marmaduke Row, Hilltop, Missouri. When you think of history, think Colonel B.H. Quickfoot, publisher. And now more from Lin Waterhouse. Lin, take us through what actually happened. What caused this tragedy?
Well, we'll never know. Forensics back in 1928 weren't very well developed yet. They did bring in a couple of experts, one from the railroad who worked with explosions associated with the railroad. Another was an engineer. I don't know what kind of engineer. That wasn't clear. But they brought him in from Springfield to examine the site and to give his opinions of what the cause might be. And of course, there were plenty of questions about and suggestions and beliefs of local people who had been there. Um, the prevailing belief was that Joseph Weiser, who owned the garage that was located under Bond Hall and was working there late that night, had caused the explosion. And there were all sorts of reasons behind that. They thought he had blown it up for the insurance on the cars that he had in the building. However, he was 3 months behind in his paying his premiums. So if he were going to blow up the building for insurance, certainly he would have made sure that his insurance policies were paid up. Another said that Joseph Weiser was having an affair with a local divorcee, and he was going to run off. He wanted to blow up the building, collect the insurance to run off with her. And as you can imagine, it got crazier and crazier all the time. Um, one of the witnesses who was standing at the Arcade Hotel, who was that was a block north of the buildings. So behind, he was looking at the buildings from the rear. Said that he actually saw the moment of the explosion, and he explained it as a pinwheel in the center of this explosion of the ignition, and that it was burning with a blue and yellow and green light.
Blue?
And when
You say blue.
blue and yellow and green light, he said, was his description of it. And I think at the time that was kind of overlooked because I don't think that they knew exactly what color gases might burn as. But when I suggested that to the Chief Bean, who was head of the West Plains fire department when I was writing the book, he said that there were only two things that burned in those colors, and that was sulfur and methane. And I also spoke to Tom Ailey, who has now passed on, but he was head of the Ozark Underground Lab in Pro-Tem, which is actually an international organization that he heads up. And he agreed with Chief Bean that very likely the source of that explosion was either methane or sulfur.
Okay.
So we go back to what
Well, let's take that apart for a second, because if it was sulfur, everybody'd smell it. If
Right.
somebody'd packed the thing full of gunpowder, it wouldn't have caught on fire. It would have just blown it up.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're talking gas, West Plains had no, and I know this, but West Plains had no municipal gas system at the time.
Correct.
There were accelerants in the garage. We know there were accelerants in the garage. Unpack that a little bit for us, because that's kind of obvious, having an automotive garage directly underneath.
Yeah, the mechanic that worked for Mr. Weiser testified that there were up to 30 vehicles parked in that garage. Cars back then were really small, and he would pack all those vehicles in there at night. And but the mechanic testified that most of them had very little gasoline in them because Mr. Weiser was kind of cheap, and he was not going to waste gasoline on vehicles that were just sitting there. And there was a 50-gallon tank of gasoline in the garage, like the old farm tanks. You still see them around sometimes, they're on a stand, and
Right.
most of them are outside. But back then, they didn't realize that they were dangerous to have inside. And so that was, at one point, people said, well, that's probably what it was, that the gasoline blew up. But the engineer who had been asked to view the debris found that tank intact. So it had not blown up. The gasoline had run out of it, but the tank itself was intact. So there was no explosion of that tank.
So the gasoline had ran out of it and probably added to the fire,
Sure. Yeah,
but
absolutely.
the seams and everything, the tank was not ruptured. It was just, huh.
Yeah, he surmised that probably the fitting that controlled the gasoline, access and egress had probably ruptured in the fire and had opened up and the tank had drained then.
I
But
turned
the
that thing
tank did
into a
not.
flamethrower. I mean,
Yeah.
good grief. That would certainly make it very hard to get out of the bottom. You're not getting out of the bottom
Yeah,
because,
absolutely. And Mr. Weiser did die that night. He was one of the victims. He was actually found in the field behind the building. And so he may have been blasted out through the back of the building, but
whoa.
he was found in the field behind it.
Now, did I read that there were documents with him, like maybe,
Yes, there were documents on his person that indicated that he was in bankruptcy. And that was another issue, with people talking about him blowing up the building for the insurance, because he was either in or on the verge of bankruptcy. But the bank manager testified to the coroner's jury that he was actually improving his situation and that he was on the verge of emerging from bankruptcy. And the mechanic had talked about they had some parts there that they had ordered from GM and they were returning them for the cash, and that would help their cash flow. And so there was some thought that he was there that night cleaning auto parts to be returned. Um, in fact, the day before, he had actually returned a big shipment of auto parts on the train that afternoon. So that was one way he was trying to improve his financial situation.
my guess is he was cleaning them with gas,
Absolutely, that would
leaded
definitely be what
gas.
they would. Mhm.
Just wonderful cleaner. You can clean anything with.
And there was a fire that night. I mean, they know there was a fire in his garage that night, but nobody knows the source of it, or obviously or apparently he would probably not intentionally start a fire in his own garage. But maybe he had a fire. Who knows? It was probably cold. Maybe he had a fire. They sometimes they burn fires in barrels and that kind of thing just for the heat. Nobody will ever know. It's today is um we can surmise all we want. And of course there were all kinds of rumors. There had been an itinerant traveling preacher in town who had gotten into a dispute with the mayor about where he would let him preach. And he wanted to preach on the courthouse steps, and the mayor wouldn't let him. And so he had made threats against the community. And some people thought that maybe he was responsible. And then there was someone else who had been asking about the building and a um a restaurant, like a little luncheonette, and he had been making some comments about, well, those were pretty old buildings. They would probably really go up in a fire. And so they had blamed that man, but poor Mr. Weiser was really the one who kind of got hung with it. And because they couldn't come up with an answer, and because they didn't, rumor just filled up the vacuum.
Now, you mentioned that the concrete floor was broken in the
Hmm.
bottom.
Hmm.
Now, that would sort of lead me to believe that there was gas underneath the floor and there was gas that had leaked up through the floor. You get a
Yes.
spark, maybe you've got buckets of gas sitting around.
Uh-huh.
Maybe, maybe that thing's leaking. Maybe it's not. You don't know. But 50 gallons of gas isn't going to do that. They're going to make a heck of a mess, but it's not going to do that. So
Yes.
the gas is almost an afterthought. The gas just made it even worse, but it wasn't necessarily what caused it. So maybe you and I visited beforehand. Maybe unpack where that gas could have came from.
Yeah, West Plains, particularly that part of West Plains, is karst topography, and it is just the catacomb. The ground underneath is catacombed with caves and all sorts of um, uh, what am I, caverns and that kind of thing underneath the soil. And when I spoke to Tom Ailey, who is an expert on that sort of thing, and also I talked to the professor from MSU who taught about the karst topography here. He also mentioned that could be very likely that there was methane gas that what has had settled into those caverns and those caves and the underground what am I anyway, it could very well have been leaking up through that cracked floor in that building. And
Was the floor
methane,
cracked on either one of the buildings on either side?
that I don't know. There was no testimony about that. But there was testimony about the Ward building that the floor was badly cracked.
And it wasn't cracked before.
Oh yeah, no, it was cracked prior to the explosion. Yes.
So we're saying gas builds up underneath the building for whatever reason, and it starts leaking up through this crack in a place that would probably catch on fire anyway, given what they were doing. And then it ignited. When it ignited all that gas below.
Yes. And they say that
or it filled up the room and then ignited either way.
Yeah, methane, they said it causes huge explosions, just huge explosions. And there have been other examples of that. I think there was an example of a very large explosion somewhere in Kentucky when methane had seeped up from underground caverns and had created a huge explosion. So this is not the first example, but at the time that was not at all considered. They 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 did not even mention that. As far as the only thing that was mentioned was that the floor was badly cracked. That was the only thing, and that was just kind of a sidebar. It was not seemed to be accepted as pertinent to the situation.
So at the time, nobody really had a suitable explanation.
Correct.
It was just sort of a mystery.
Right, and that's why poor Mr. Weiser got blamed. He had already been buried. They exhumed his body, and I have a copy of the autopsy report. And he was definitely in the building at the time of the explosion, according to the doctors that did the autopsy, because of the condition of his body, because of the burns and the just there was there were actually a lot of there were burns, but there were also a lot of just really red marks, which they were not quite sure how to explain. These doctors, they had probably never seen anything like this before. This kind of an explosion, this kind of damage to human bodies. The one elderly lady told me that she remembered she was in her 90s, and she actually remembered the explosion at that time. And she said that her mother would not let them go out to play because there were body parts all over town. So
Good
it was
grief.
just, yeah, it was just horrible, just horrible. And there were 19 people that were unidentified. They knew who was there only by who didn't come home that night and by witnesses who remembered, who they saw there that night. Um, so 19, actually 20 people are buried under, there's a big granite monument over in Oak Lawn Cemetery in West Plains, and there are 20 people buried under that, 20 caskets with body parts that were divided amongst the caskets. And then their names are all memorialized on the monument. But there were some people that were simply vaporized. There was
Well,
nothing left.
if the theory's right, and I'm no expert, I know nothing about structural fires. I know nothing about, incendiary devices or anything. But if you have enough gas there to do what it says it's doing, then those that would be in that area where they would get the full brunt of that would be vaporized. I mean, you're
Yeah.
talking an enormous amount of not only just force and concussion, but you're talking an enormous amount of heat from zero to, a blast furnace, basically.
Yeah. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and then the top, the whole, the top of the building, when you describe that pinwheel, it sounds like to me almost like the guys on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok that are making a rocket stove.
Yeah.
The pinwheel, of course, for those who don't know, the pinwheel would have been the firework of the day. It was a circular deal that would go up in the air. You can find lots of videos on YouTube, but that would be a a description that would be like almost like a small mushroom cloud in a
Yeah.
way.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so you're talking an enormous amount of energy, an enormous amount of energy. And so for reference, how far away were the windows broken? How far away was it heard?
Yeah, well, it's heard 20 miles away, almost to Thayer. There were people that actually heard it and stopped their vehicles because they thought something had happened, immediately around them. Um, and the it blew out the windows all around the square, of course, and then down Washington Avenue is a street that goes down south from the square, and it blew out windows all along Washington Avenue. And the concussion was such that it damaged the courthouse, which sat in the middle of the square, to the extent that it had to be torn down. So,
Holy mackerel.
yeah, yeah,
Was the
it was.
courthouse, I'm not familiar with the Howell County Courthouse. Was it an old courthouse?
Yeah, it was quite a few years old. It was kind of a neat looking place. It was kind of a gothic looking structure,
Mm.
and of course all wooden, but huge, just a great three-story structure.
It was
And
frame. It was frame.
yes. Uh-huh.
Well, after a good fire, you decide you probably don't want the courthouse to be frame anymore.
Yeah. Well, and now, and that's kind of interesting too, that immediately after the explosion, there just happened to be a statewide meeting of fire chiefs and fire marshals, and they were all coming together to talk about changes that were probably needed throughout the state as far as fire laws. And it just so happened that it just followed the explosion so perfectly that there were many, many changes that resulted throughout Missouri because of this group meeting just immediately after the explosion and seeing the terrible damage. And those buildings were old. They probably should have been condemned years before and rebuilt, but They they were part of the community, and people just accepted them as they were.
Uh, I don't know that they were really much of a problem till they got blown up. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
didn't seem to have anything really bad going on until they were blown from the earth, blasted.
Yeah, and they were well used too. That was one of the things that I was really surprised to see was when I was researching through the old newspapers that the parties that were held there and the baby showers and just big events that were held in Bond Hall. I mean, it was just part of the community.
Well, so where does the city of West Plains and the community, a grieving community now, where do they move from here? What tell us about what happens next, if you would.
Well, the odd thing was that the coroner's jury was convened the very next day. It met for 2 days and then it adjourned. And that was the end of the investigation into the explosion, the official investigation into the explosion. Um, um, the man that was a prosecuting attorney at the time was quoted as saying that they really didn't want to find or name one person as being responsible because they were afraid there'd be a lynching. So I don't know whether why they handled it so simplistically. I don't know. I mean, I just don't quite understand. You would think that, this would be something this would be examined for years and years and studied and some sort of a decision made as to what was happening, but it just didn't happen. It was just kind of brushed under the rug. And the sad thing, we had talked about this in our other conversation, was that there were religious forces that claimed that because they couldn't come up with a culprit who had caused this explosion, that God had blown up these people because they were dancing, because dancing was considered to be a sin. And that became, oddly enough, a really prevailing belief in West Plains for many years. Even when I first started investigating, um, people old, I was asking my husband's elderly relatives about what they remembered about what they had heard about it and that kind of thing. And they all told me, just leave it alone. This was God's retribution.
Hmm. Well, God's retribution against who? The dancers, the
The
property
dancers,
owners.
the dancers, how sad. And the sad thing was that because of that attitude, um, the families really weren't allowed to grieve. There were the funerals and that sort of thing, but they just weren't allowed to grieve because so many people believed, well, they got what they deserved. They were dancing.
Wow.
Yeah,
Makes
it's hard for
Footloose
us to understand that now.
makes the theme of Footloose seem rather tame.
Yeah, it sure does. Good point.
Uh, well, so if you go to West Plains today and you want to find some of these sites, you mentioned the public cemetery. There's a memorial there. Where else around West Plains can you find out more about this?
There's really nothing. The site of the explosion, there were buildings built, of course, on that site. Eventually, it was a number of things over the years after the explosion. They left it for months because insurance companies were haggling over who should pay what. And but then eventually it was cleared up and it became a parking lot, and eventually buildings were built on that site. And just, I think it's 3 or 4 years ago, oddly enough, that exact same location burned again. There,
Wow.
it was very strange. Yeah, just that same location, the building built on that same lot burned again. that time it was, it was kept to just that building, but it didn't burn the whole block down, unfortunately.
Didn't
But
blow up in an entire generation either.
exactly, yes. And that was the sadness of it, was that it really did. It blew up an entire generation. And Mayor Evans had said to me he really thought West Plains today would be a very different place had those young people lived.
Well, if you want to find out more about the West Plains Dance Hall explosion, I encourage you. I was going to interlibrary loan it. I couldn't find a copy, and I'm waiting on it. I was hoping to get it before interview. I wanted to read some of it, but I did not get a chance. Just to be perfectly honest. But it's from the History Press, Arcadia Publishing. And Lynn, where can they find that book if they want to?
It's pretty much available anywhere online. Amazon has it, and Barnes and Noble, all of them carry it. You should be able to find it there.
Okay. And then I want to talk. One of the things I want to do on the podcast is I want to talk to creators, and Lynn is definitely a creator. And I want to get a creator's perspective about some of her other work. Lynn is also the author of two novels, Bred to the Bone, Deadly Secrets at Hunter's Mill, and The Ghost of Timmy Wall, Eternal Secrets at Hunter's Mill, both published by Outpost Publishing and all available on Amazon. Lynn, take us through because writing an historical work, whether dance hall explosion, shootout, event, whatever is one thing, but fiction's another craft entirely. So take us through your before you go your fiction work and some of your books and kind of what inspired you, and maybe tell us a little bit about your creative process.
When we first moved back here, we moved here from California and Arizona, and we lived out in Ozarks County, out just adjacent. Our property was just adjacent to the Hodgson's Mill property, so it's very rural out there, and it was quite a lot of culture shock for I kind of considered myself a city girl, and at least a townie, and it was quite a culture shock for me, and I'm such a history buff, though. I just love to talk to everybody out there about the history of the area, and my husband has a huge family that still lives out there, and so they were just great about telling me stories and relating things from the past. Some of them true, some of them not. I'm sure, some were great stories that I was pretty sure were not true. But I sat down and I wrote Bred to the Bone was actually the first book that I wrote. And I wrote it based on the stories that I had heard in out there in Ozark County, and about a murder. Of course, it's a murder mystery. And I just incorporated a lot of the stories that I had heard. And the same is true of The Ghost of Timmy Wall. That was actually based on a true story. I worked as a docent at the Hodgson's Mill for quite a few years after we moved back here, which I loved doing. And the only death that ever occurred at Hodgson's Mill was that of a young boy. And I believe he was 4 years old. And he somehow became entangled in the milling equipment and was crushed to death at Hodgson's Mill. And so I wrote The Ghost of Timmy Wall, which was a fictionalized story around the death of that young man whose name was Judson Warden. And I found his grave over at the little cemetery there in Dora. And I always remember to put flowers on his grave because he has no family left anymore. And he was just a little boy. And it was a picture of him and his dog. And so I incorporated that relationship, a boy and his dog, in the story of him as a ghost haunting the mill.
How long did
And
it
the
take
mill,
you? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Hunter's Mill, which is the mill in the books, is actually based on Hodgson's Mill. I could not use the name, so I renamed it. But it's it's very it is identical to the to Hodgson's Mill.
Interesting. So, how long did it take you to write those? How over how many months or years did you work those?
I probably worked on the first one maybe 6 or 8 months, and then to finish it. And then, of course, I went back and, you go back over them and over them and over them and over them again. And Timmy came a little bit faster. I think I got him down maybe in about 6 months. And because that story just seemed to kind of write itself, I found that easier to write.
I recently had a someone who wants to write ask me, and why they were asking me, I don't know. I've written a couple little things, but nothing major. What do you need to do? And my advice is you need to sit your ass down and write,
Yeah. Yeah.
because writing equals keeping your butt in the chair. What's describe your process? I know there's somebody out there that this will probably help. Talk about how Lin Waterhouse writes.
Um, for me, I kind of went with my own as I became inspired. I actually have known myself to be driving and to stop and pull over to the side of the road and write something down that I don't want to forget because it suddenly came to me, and I wrote the entire prologue to Bread to the Bone while my husband and I were traveling from West Plains back to Ozark County. My agent had said to me, "You need a prologue on that," and I said, "Oh, okay." And I wrote the whole thing just on the 30-minute trip from West Plains back to Ozark County. It just came that easily. But other times, it's just you're just pulling every word out. But I tried to be pretty disciplined. I tried to make a point of writing so many hours every day. Um, and I was also doing some newspaper and magazine articles at the same time. So I didn't, my work on the books was more sporadic than because other things had deadlines.
We know about the Ozark Mountaineer. Where else were you writing for?
I wrote for the Ozark County Times is the Ozark County newspaper. And I did a regular column for them, a feature column for them, and got to interview some really fascinating people around Ozark County. And then I also wrote for Ozark Magazine when it existed. It no longer exists again anymore. I did one piece for the St. Louis paper, and just kind of odds and ends. I would be requested to write for something, and I would research a subject and write it. I wrote a copy for a company for a while, for it with Vitamin Company for a while. So just I've done a lot of different things.
You didn't write the Flintstones jingle, did you?
No,
The
unfortunately, that would probably
Flintstones
would have made me
vitamin
some
jingle.
money. Yeah, no.
I'm the generation that ate those. We're probably immune to everything.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm in that same bunch too. I remember having those up on the shelf.
Flintstone vitamins. Gosh, they were nasty too. I remember they came out with a berry and it tasted kind of like toothpaste. It was awful. But um, so any further plans, any projects on the horizon for Lynn? What's next?
Not really. At this point, my husband became very ill. He had Parkinson's, and I cared for him for quite a few years before he had to go into a nursing home, and then I just sort of lost my muse in those years that I was taking care of him, and now he's gone. but and I have done a few pieces that people have asked me to do. I did one for the MSU magazine, the name of which I don't recall right now.
The,
Um,
the Ozarks Watch magazine,
yeah, I guess that's what it.
not
I'm
the
not sure what
alumni
it.
magazine. That's the
No, it's the magazine that they do. It's a lovely magazine, a nice color magazine, and one Susan Kelly is the editor, and she was owner, publisher, and editor of Ozark magazine years back, and she and I are friends. I wrote for her for a number of years, and we've just stayed friends. She did ask me to do a piece for them, and I did do that. But and I do some editing. I still do take in some editing jobs and edit all my friends my friends' works, and so I keep my hand in a little bit, but I'm not real active anymore.
well, hopefully you find something to inspire you.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, the Ozarks is a fascinating place to live, and you could just look all around and find all sorts of stories, as you know. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
you're doing
Well,
with your
yeah,
podcast,
it is. And actually, I really wanted to do the podcast just to get down some of the stories that I've wanted to tell that maybe I wanted to work through before I wrote. But then I find out that now I'm collecting stuff that I didn't know that I was going to be collecting. And now I'm like,
Hmm.
oh, so it's really important because I've never heard one particular story or another or whatever. And
every time
so,
I every time I do a program or a book signing, and I still do them pretty often. I still do get asked to do them fairly regularly. Somebody will come up and tell me a story that I've not heard before. And it's pretty amazing. I try to record them all and keep them with all of my information because it's just fascinating. There's just so much to tell.
yeah, I'm a terrible scribbler. And I was looking through the other day and I'm organizing some stuff and I'm like, oh, there's a bunch of receipts. I wonder what they're doing in here. Well, they were like from the feed store where you get when you're supposed to hand in your deal, I would write on it while I was waiting to give it to them to load the truck.
Ah,
But
you're
all
like
these
me. See,
notes
it's like,
on I'm like, man, I need an intern. I to organize all this because um,
you
well,
need a little recorder. You need a little handheld recorder to
then I'd
record
never
through.
try.
Well, you could probably do that on your phone.
I need I need like Rosie off of the Jetsons, just that could sit there and do data entry and stuff like that. I'm holding out for Rosie off the Jetsons.
Okay, all right.
So
You do that.
I'll say as soon as I'm through with her, I'll send her down your way, and you can use.
Okay, yeah, I could use her too. My desk is an absolute disaster here. So, and I have
Well,
a ton of company coming for Thanksgiving. I need to clean up.
well, we'll let you get to it here, Lynn. Where can folks follow you or get a hold of you if they wish to reach out?
I'm on Facebook and I'm fairly active still on Facebook, so you could find me there and message me through Facebook. I do have a website, linwaterhouse.com and or .org, both. And so there is information there as well.
Bet they can order some of those books there too, can't they?
Yeah, well, yeah, they probably they might, except that I've not been real good about keeping that website up. So they'd be better off to contact me through Facebook and I'll get them books.
I'll bet you get them a signed copy.
I certainly would.
All right. Well, Lynn, we have so enjoyed talking with you today and learning about the terrible story of the West Plains dance hall explosion. Um, it is truly, I've never quite heard, there may be others out there, but I have never quite heard a story like that in the Ozarks. It's almost like something you might hear out of a war or a bomb
Uh-huh.
or a terrorist attack or something. And to think that it happened over 100 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And when did
Almost
it
100 years. 1928, almost
1928. Okay, I had the year wrong. I had the year wrong. And so, almost 100 years ago. So that is just really something. I so appreciate you coming today and sharing with us. And I want to encourage, if you have check Lynn's books out and let us know below if you have a question for Lynn on when we put this out on social media. I'm sure I'll tag her in it. So if you have a question, let her know.
And some great stories if they have them.
Yeah, if you've got further stories, she's still collecting. That's great.
Yes, I am.
Be sure to follow us on this platform as well as all platforms where you get your podcasts. Also, be sure to check out our offerings on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Look for updates and extra content. We want to give you a big thank you for that. Maybe you've got a local mystery, legend, historical fact that needs plumbed. Maybe you want to say, Lin Waterhouse, hold my beer. You've got something even worse. Maybe you've just got a wild story to share. Or maybe you want to tell us something important that's going on. We'd love to hear from you. Drop us an email at wildandwoollyozarks@gmail.com. I want to thank my producer, Kenneth Herron, media coordinator, Raina Barth. Climb W. Herron is still house gamekeeper. Well, until next time, you all be careful, and boys, if you would, please be good to the tourists. Bye now.